Welcome to this presentation on the greatest turning point of all in American history, the Civil War. Now, I have to admit up front, this is the most difficult to really try to do justice to in about 50 minutes. It's practically impossible. In fact, typically in this class, I really dispense with the PowerPoints and things like that and really just try to address a few questions that come up from the class or things that might need clarification from our popular understanding of the Civil War. But I have put together a PowerPoint still for this, but I admit it's very rudimentary. It doesn't really do justice to talking about this conflict in just a 50-minute or so time period. So um, I will try to stay focused on some of the big issues here, the reasons the war took place. Some of that will be a bit of review. And then we'll look at certain advantages and disadvantages each side had. Almost every textbook starts there when talking about the Civil War. And we will talk about some of the highlights of the war itself, some of the battles. This is not meant to be a military history approach or looking at every troop movement and maneuver, though those can be very significant. We're just mainly going to make sure you understand some of the big conflicts in this war and how the war turned, how it could have gone other ways. So, for starters, let's remind ourselves why this Civil War was taking place. Ultimately, it's two big issues. Um, we could talk about slavery as a cause of the conflict and about the argument over states' rights. But both of these need a bit of explanation. It would be too simplistic to just say this was a war over slavery and that's it. It's just slave states versus non slave states. Because, in fact, there were several slave states that stay in the Union. Either they didn't have a population that wanted to secede, or there were Union troops there fast enough to prevent them from seceding. So you can see from this map the red highlights some of these states who did have slavery, but who were not, who did not leave the Union to join the Confederacy. Missouri, Kentucky. This already highlights a West Virginia, which was not a state yet, but it becomes one in the Civil War. Really, these counties of Virginia break away. But Maryland and Delaware were already states, and they also had slaves, but do not break away from the Union. So this is not simply a war between slave states and free states. There are slave states on both sides of the conflict. Now, another very important point, this is not simply a war of slaveholders versus non slaveholders. We must remember that even in the Confederacy, the vast majority of the population were not slave owners. Now, they may have hoped to be slave owners someday because that was a sign that you were wealthier. You had arrived. You had more wealth if you had slaves. But it was a minority of the population that even had one slave. Now, if we just take the slave owning population by themselves, even there, the vast majority of slave owners work in the fields with their slaves. They have, a handful, maybe 1 to 5 slaves, and they still do manual labor along with the slaves. No, the plantation class was definitely an elite class, those that could own 20 slaves or more, and who had a slave driver or someone who puts those slaves to work, and the master himself is not having to do manual labor. That was really a small percentage of those engaged in this. Those were the small percentage of the Confederate population. So it can't simply be seen as a conflict between slave owners and non slave owners. Another thing that complicates this is Abraham Lincoln makes it very plain at the beginning of this war that the conflict is really about preserving the Union. Abraham Lincoln was not initially going to war to free anyone. The war was about bringing the Union back together. President Lincoln said, it is impossible for a state to secede. Once you are part of this Union, there's no getting out. There's no such thing as breaking up the Union. So the war, especially in the early stages, is about preserving the Union. It's not a war to free anyone. But now that purpose does come in, as we will see later on. So the slavery issue was quite complicated, but make no mistake, slavery is at the heart of this conflict. It would be going way too far to say slavery somehow had nothing to do with this. No, every state that seceded from the Union made it plain the reason they're leaving the Union was because they felt that their rights, their property rights, were about to be restricted. And it didn't matter how much Abraham Lincoln protested and said this was not going to be the case, that they had nothing to fear of, um, of the national government trying to stop slavery where it already existed. Those Confederate states were convinced Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans, they are set to abolish slavery. They're linked in with the abolitionists. And so, of course, these Confederate states do separate from the Union because they want to protect their institution of slavery. It is at the heart of the Civil War. But it's just a bit more complicated because it's not as if the entire Confederacy were slave owners. And it's not as if those were the only slave owning states in the Union. And it's not the original purpose of fighting the war. The war is being fought for the preservation of the Union. Now, the other great cause of this war was the argument over states' rights. And this goes back all the way to the beginning of the United States, from the time that there was an Articles of Confederation that was altered and became the Constitution of the United States. There were arguments then about what the relationship should be between a national government and state governments. And we saw even in this course just earlier examples of conflicts over states' rights. 1798, Kentucky and Virginia both say we're rejecting the national law, the Alien and Sedition Acts. That was an example of states saying we get the final say on what is constitutional and what is not. And then in the Jacksonian period, there were several issues like that that came up. South Carolina attempts to nullify a national law. And in the issue of Cherokee removal, Andrew Jackson sides with the state of Georgia over the ruling of the Supreme Court. There were several cases in Andrew Jackson's period where there was some confusion about states' rights. Is it really the national government that has the final say, or is it states who have the final say in lawmaking? Now, in more recent times, I'm saying more recent, closer to the Civil War, we had the Fugitive Slave Law, that should just say slave, not slaver, Fugitive Slave Law, Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, all those things, while they were about slavery, they also were about the authority of the federal government versus state governments. Can state governments insist that those, it was actually a national law, the Fugitive Slave Law, that says you must cooperate and help apprehend these slaves to return them. Well, in that case, northern states were saying, we're not following that law. You can't make us follow that national law. So the issues of slavery, the issues of states' rights and its argument together, those have pushed the nation to this conflict. Now, what about the advantages and disadvantages of either side in this conflict? They're fairly obvious to some, and they're almost always in a textbook. describing the early parts of this war. Of course, the Union had the advantage in population. They had lots more people. They had lots more industry capability of making weapons, much more industrial output there. They have a navy, whereas the Confederate side doesn't really have a lot of navy. Um, so certainly the North has great advantages there. But the North does have the disadvantage that they are going to be going on an offensive war. They have to go and conquer, whereas the South really just has to defend. The Southern states did not have to conquer the North in order to win. They just have to be difficult enough to subdue that the Union Army would give up and they could be free. They could be their own Confederate States of America. Well, on the Confederate side, they do have the advantage of defending home. They do know the terrain better. Almost all, the vast majority of the battles in this conflict are going to be taking place in the Confederate States, especially Virginia, Tennessee. And those southern states have the advantage of just playing defense. They just have to drive the Union Army out or make them so exhausted and kill enough of them that the Union gives up, says, let them be a separate country. It doesn't matter. Let them go about doing things their own way. Now, both sides had really fine military leadership. You see the pictures here of Ulysses S. Grant, who will end up being commanding general for the North, Robert E. Lee for the South. But for the size of their population, the South really had greater military leadership and more military experience. They have several of their own military schools, as well as those who've graduated from West Point in New York. And that's somewhat of an advantage they may have as well. But here's something we often overlook. A great disadvantage of the South, not only in having fewer people, less industry, although those are very important. Another disadvantage the South had was a crisis of identity. Who is this new Confederate States of America? Are they going to be a new nation? Or is it really just a loose collection of states? Since states' rights is one of the things that they have asserted as their reasons for breaking away from the Union. Let me illustrate this conflict, this crisis of identity, by looking at two of the leaders among the Confederacy. The president of the Confederate States of America was named Jefferson Davis. And Jefferson Davis believed that the Confederacy now constituted a new nation. It was a better nation, he believed, even than the United States. The United States had some great, glorious beginnings, but Jefferson Davis believed they have faded in their glory, and they have really gone beyond the Constitution to create an overpowering federal government, and one that threatens the institution of slavery now. Jefferson Davis believed, though, this Confederate States, this was going to be an even greater nation. It takes the good from the United States, it gets back to its origins, and even makes some improvements. You know, the new Constitution of the Confederacy made it very explicit that this was a Christian nation, something the United States Constitution is silent on. But the Confederate States are going to say, we are a Christian nation. And Jefferson Davis believed that they should create a real identity, a real sense of connection with this Confederacy. They should generate this nationalism, only in a more Southern way. They should be Confederate nationalists, especially during a time of war when they're going to have to cooperate with one another, various states cooperating to fight in this conflict. But on the other side, there were a number of people who thought Jefferson Davis is going too far in trying to create a nation when it is nationalism and a strong central government is what they've tried to escape. Imagine the irony here. There are a number of leaders like Vice President Alexander Stephens. He was the vice president of the Confederacy. Alexander Stephens of Georgia believed Jefferson Davis's government has become too powerful. It demands too much from each of its member states, and it's just as bad, if not worse, to sacrifice your state sovereignty to your supposed Southern friends. That was perhaps even worse than losing your state sovereignty to the whole United States. Now, this is one of the real dilemmas, the problems with this whole ideology of states' rights. It is a recipe for dismantling a nation. If every little part, every regional part, every state part can declare its own independence and its separate nature from the rest. So here you had, among the Confederate States, a president who believed strongly in creating a sense of Confederate nationalism, still being proud of the parts of U.S. history that they liked, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they claimed those parts, but then creating a new sense of Confederate or Southern nationalism. And then on the other hand, we have a vice president, Alexander Stephens, and many others who believed it was the purpose was states' rights. We didn't leave the Union in order to just create another strong union. States should be able to govern themselves. So this is quite a disadvantage for the Southern states, the Confederate states. What is it they're really hoping to achieve? Confederate nationalism or the freedom of each of those individual states? Well, here's where we really have to be brief in addressing some of the major conflicts in this war. And again, this is not a military history course. I'm not a military historian. I do teach a course in the Civil War, and it's difficult to try to fit an entire course into one 50-minute lecture. So we just skim the surface in this class. But I do want you to be aware of some of the major conflicts here and some misunderstandings people have about the conflict. Well, first of all, the first battle of this war is going to take place in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. It makes sense since South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union. This is going to be where the first fight takes place. Fort Sumter was a federal fort. When South Carolina belonged to the United States, this is a fort that the national government had started to build, and it protected the opening to the city of Charleston. But now that South Carolina had seceded from the Union, they claimed that fort as theirs. It belongs to the state of South Carolina and the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America. So South Carolina wants the Union soldiers out. They want American soldiers out of that fort because it's South Carolina property now. Well, the Union soldiers are not leaving that fort. In fact, they go to try to fortify it. It's not really a completed fort. And here there's a showdown. There's Union soldiers within this fort, and there's a growing number of South Carolina citizens isolating it. It is an island out in the opening to the port of Charleston. And there's all these people on the shore, militia, and people ready to fight for South Carolina, threatening this fort. Abraham Lincoln had to handle the situation delicately. He knew if he sends in a lot of reinforcements to this fort, it will spark a war. But if he sends nothing, then South Carolina can just starve that fort out. No new goods will arrive, no food will arrive, and the Union soldiers there will just be at the mercy of South Carolina. So Lincoln tries to do something in between and say he's not going to send new military supplies or new men, but he does want to send food. Well, um, South Carolina takes um, some of these efforts as aggressive on the part of the United States. South Carolina still wants the Union soldiers out. And so when American ships try to run through the blockade and try to reinforce this fort, South Carolina decides to take the fort. So there's lots of shooting, lots of shelling of this fort. Um, very little, really no loss of life here. But finally, those inside the fort will surrender. And South Carolina had claimed their property, their fort, and it had sparked a war. Now, Abraham Lincoln calls for 70,000 men to volunteer to join the army because he's going to force this state back into the Union. Well, once this took place, then it's not just the lower 7 states that create the Confederacy. Now other states will join the Confederacy, like Arkansas and Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. Or other states join, and making 11 states officially in the Confederacy. Now, the Confederacy will also consider that Missouri is a part and Kentucky is a part, because there are people in those states that wanted to join the Confederacy. The Union troops will be there and prevent any of these other slave states from joining the Confederacy. Same could be said about Maryland as well. Union troops will hold them in the Union. So the war has started with Fort Sumter. That's why we remember it. It's the first battle of the Civil War, but the first significant battle of any real significant size, was the Battle of Bull Run, or um, the Southern name for it was the first Battle of Manassas. Often there's 2 names for these battles. One will be after a nearby body of water, like Bull Run Creek, and another name the Southerners would use a nearby town, the town of Manassas. Today, this is just on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. It's a suburb. So this was a battle just outside the nation's capital. And by the way, the Confederate capital had been moved to Richmond once Virginia seceded from the Union. So the 2 capitals are actually very close to one another, Washington, D.C. and Richmond. Um, just about a 2.5 or 3 hour drive apart now, depending on traffic. So this was the first real big battle where 2 armies clash with one another, significant numbers of men, significant casualties, but neither side was very organized. Neither side is really very experienced here. So this is almost like 2 armed gangs clashing against each other. And early on, this looked like it might be a Union victory. There's crowds of people from Washington, D.C. who come out and sit on hillsides, and out in the distance, they can see this battle taking place. They've come to see the Union Army whip up on these rebels and bring them back into the Union. So it's an exciting spectacle to witness. But instead, the Confederate is not sent running. They hold their line. In fact, there's a hero made of the South in this battle. This is where Thomas Stonewall Jackson is not driven back. And in fact, it rallies other Confederates to stand like he was, like a stone wall, not being driven back. And in fact, they send the Union Army running. So this is a Confederate victory, and really quite a shock to people in Washington, D.C., that if the Confederates had decided to take advantage and continue pursuing the Union Army, they could be knocking on the doors of Washington, D.C. very quickly. Now, That was quite a shock, a surprise, 1861. But a battle that will be much more sobering takes place much further west, the Battle of Shiloh. And you can find it here in western Tennessee. It's not terribly far from Memphis, but a pretty good drive from the city of Memphis. But Shiloh, there's really a battle that has to do with controlling the Mississippi River, and the Union Army had already done well driving into Tennessee, and here is a place where the Confederates are going to try to push them back. And this conflict was bigger than anything that had happened on the continent up to this point. Shiloh had more casualties than most previous wars in American history, complete entire wars. And this is just one battle over a couple of days period. There will be bigger battles in Shiloh to come. Absolutely. There'll be several bigger than Shiloh, but this was a sobering moment that Americans had to realize this is not going to be a brief war with limited casualties that will end in 3 to 6 months or something like this. This is one where the carnage is going to build up, that battles will count the dead and wounded and missing in the tens of thousands, numbers that they couldn't even wrap their head around because there hadn't been that many people lost in the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Mexican American War, all those things combined. And now it's happening in single battles in this war. Well, Shiloh was a battle that the Union forces would end up winning. It was Confederate advantage on the first day, but Ulysses S. Grant brings in reinforcements, and the Union Army wins the battle in the following day. But this battle really just named after a nearby church, Shiloh, place of peace, Shalom, Shiloh, turns out to be anything but a place of peace. It is a place of carnage, and the Union Army was winning the war in the West and taking control of more and more of the Mississippi River. Now, another significant battle is Antietam, and this is one of the few battles that takes place outside of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee had done a very good job defending any attempts to come into Virginia and subdue Richmond. Robert E. Lee really grows to legendary status because he's great at outfoxing the Union Army or being more aggressive than they are, even when he's outnumbered, and defeating the Union Army. And in 1862, he figured what they really needed was go on the offensive, take the war to the Union, and win battles there. If the war is actually taking place in the North, they'll grow tired of this war much more quickly, and they'll decide to just leave the Confederacy alone. Let them be a separate country. They'll probably still carry on trade with one another for sure. Well, that was the plan here. Robert E. Lee was going to take forces into the North, and this is really just into Maryland, and you can see Antietam here. The Battle of Antietam, or also known as Sharpsburg. Well, this was the single bloodiest day of the war. The Battle of Antietam creates something like 25,000 casualties in a day. Dead or seriously wounded or missing men, 25,000 in a single day. It's really difficult to declare a winner here exactly. The Union prevents further encroachment by Robert E. Lee, so that was somewhat of a plus in their column, but Robert E. Lee gets away with his army. He's not crushed either. It's somewhat of a draw, really, but one of the other significant outcomes of this was what Abraham Lincoln issues after this battle. Lincoln had been waiting for a good battle victory to announce this new plan he had, this Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this is one of those issues that's very misunderstood that we need to clarify here. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves immediately. What Lincoln does with this proclamation, it is just a statement from the president. Lincoln says, those states who are in rebellion against the U.S., if they do not rejoin the Union, their slaves will be freed by, as if they do not rejoin the Union by the end of the year, or, by January 1st, 1863, then their slaves will be freed. Now, some interesting things to note. This has nothing to do with slaves or slave states who were still in the Union. It does not threaten slavery in Missouri or Kentucky or Maryland, Delaware. Doesn't say anything about those states. It says to you states who are in rebellion. Remember, Lincoln didn't think it was really even legal for a state to leave the Union. So this is addressed to those states who think they've seceded from the Union. If you do not rejoin, then you're going to lose your slaves. It's a threat. It's also a very effective diplomatic tool. You see, there are a number of places in Europe, another number of countries like England and France, who get a lot of cotton from the South. England buys up that cotton and they run it through their textile mills. It's big business in England. So they need cotton from somewhere if they're not getting it from the American South. And Southerners were pretty confident that England will eventually come to their rescue. England will recognize that the Confederate States of America is a legitimate country and that the United States should not be fighting this aggressive war against them. But England's also a country who has outlawed slavery. They've used their navy to do what they can to stop the slave trade. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a good diplomatic tool because what it says to England and France and any potential allies of the Confederacy, what it does is it says this war is now a lot about slavery too. This war is about, this war may end up freeing slaves if these states don't rejoin the Union. None of those countries in Europe is going to recognize the Confederate States as a legitimate government as a result of this. And this does it does change somewhat the purpose of the war. Early on, 1861, 62, Abraham Lincoln always makes it plain that the purpose of this war is to preserve the Union. If he could preserve the Union by freeing all slaves or freeing no slaves, Lincoln says, he'll take whichever course is necessary, but the whole purpose is to preserve the Union. Now, after the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the purposes does seem to be perhaps freeing slaves also. Now, some people in the North love that. Abolitionists are excited about that. That should be the purpose of the war. It's not just preserving the old Union, but making a better country, morally superior. Some people in the North are very excited about this. Others are appalled. There are a number of people in the North who say, we aren't interested in fighting a war if the purpose of that war is just to free slaves. There's a lot of racism in the North, just as there was in the South. But it's the Battle of Antietam that gives Lincoln this opportunity to make this statement. Of course, it doesn't really free slaves because those states who are rebelling against the United States don't listen to President Lincoln anyway. I mean, they'll be offended by what he said, but they don't look at him as their president or making their laws. They're just offended at the threat that this poses. So, this confirms for them that this has always been his purpose anyway. But it's not really the proclamation that's going to be saving or releasing slaves or freeing slaves. It's going to be the Union Army. Where they go, slaves can escape and get to the Union Army. And ultimately, it's going to be the 13th Amendment that ends slavery, not just in the Confederate States, but everywhere. Still, the Emancipation Proclamation was very important as it changes the direction of the war, and it certainly is a great diplomatic tool. It does not compel any of those states to come back into the Union, though. Now, as I said, Robert E. Lee was very successful when he's playing defense in Virginia, and probably the two greatest examples of that are the battles of Fredericksburg and a separate battle of Chancellorsville. We won't go into great detail here, but these are just two of his greatest victories there, particularly the Battle of Chancellorsville. He's vastly outnumbered and still divides his force to outmaneuver and outsmart the Union Army. And the big loss for him there, though, was as they had won this great victory, his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, was also killed in this conflict, shot by one of his own men, just not realizing who was coming toward him. So these are great victories for the Confederacy, but a great personal loss and symbolic loss in Stonewall Jackson's death at Chancellorsville. But this gives me the opportunity also to talk about the way each side drafted men for service. Initially, it's just people calling for volunteers, but as the war wears on, both governments are going to use a draft. They're going to compel people into service. And the age range for this draft kept growing as well. Typically, it starts off more like people from ages 18 to 35. The Confederacy is going to move that from 17 to 45. Eventually, people who are 50 might still be drafted into military service. But both sides also had exceptions. Both sides made it possible for certain wealthier people to avoid service. You could hire a substitute. You could pay for someone else to take your place. So if you had enough cash in the North, you can pay $300, and someone else will serve instead of you. Likewise, in the South, the Confederacy gave exception to people who own 20 or more slaves. If you're a big plantation owner, then that might be your get out of service free card, because you've got another service to do. You've got to keep that plantation running. So this does raise the issue of class, that wealthier people had advantages that others did not, that they could avoid military service and avoid the possibility of being killed. But it's not really true that wealthy people aren't going to be taking place in this conflict. Many of them still will volunteer or will accept their draft status. And in fact, what the war really does is it shifts a lot of money from wealthy to other people. Some people sign up because they can replace someone else. Now they're taking a risk. They may lose their lives or limbs, but there's not a lot of other ways to gain $300 cash. So there are a lot of people who will sign up for the purpose of making that substitution money. When we talk about the causes of the war, well, nationally, we might say the cause is about slavery or states' rights. But there's a lot of individuals who say, this was a way that I could make $300. So it really gets complicated when we talk about individual causes of this war. But draft laws were very unpopular. It seemed almost un-American to just say, we're not relying completely on volunteers. Government's going to compel some people to fight. It's very unpopular in the South, especially when they have this rule where if you have 20 slaves, you can avoid service. Well, that doesn't sit well with a lot of Southerners. And there's a lot of opposition to the draft in the North as well. In New York City, there's a huge riot in 1863 because of the draft laws. And the riot targets a lot of African Americans in New York because a lot of people being drafted into this war, they say, we're fighting this war now somehow to free slaves. Never should have started this. Their resentment is poured out against free blacks in the North. So the racism is there even when there's not slavery. Plus, after battles like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, there's a lot of people in the North that are wondering, why are we still fighting this? It's a losing cause. Let the South go. Who cares how they run their lives? Let's not fight and die in this conflict for the purpose of changing their slave system. Things could definitely have gone very differently in this war. But around July 4th, 1863, huge changes take place because of two big Union victories, the Battle of Gettysburg and the Battle of Vicksburg. Now, Gettysburg is this most northern battle you can see here. Once again, Robert E. Lee tries to take the war to the north, much like he had done at Antietam. And this is, after his great success at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, he thought if he could take the war to the north, if people in Pennsylvania feel this war happening there, they're going to get sick of it and they're going to want to give up. Forget trying to change Virginia. But Lee really overextends himself here. Gettysburg is the biggest battle in this war. It's over a 3-day period. And, no single day is as big as Antietam was, but, with 3 days in a row, close to that, we have over 50,000 casualties in this battle alone. So, enormous cost here, but the Union wins and drives Lee's army further south. The invasion stops. At the same time, Ulysses S. Grant had actually won a battle in Vicksburg, Mississippi. This was crucial because the Union had by that time taken control of most everything along the Mississippi River except this southern stronghold. Vicksburg had been so well fortified that Grant had tried and tried and tried, had not been able to break through. But just about the same time this Battle of Gettysburg takes place, Grant wins at Vicksburg too. So, man, this really changes things. That it seems the Union has the advantage both in the East and in the West. Seems like just a matter of time before they're going to be victorious. The war went on for another couple of years. And even though the Union is still winning some battles, the Confederacy doesn't seem any closer to just giving up. And they can still wreak havoc. Well, one great hope that the Confederacy had was the next election that Abraham Lincoln was going to have to face. The Republicans had already lost a lot of seats in the midterm elections. Democrats won a lot of those seats. And now there's a possibility of the Democratic Party in the North winning the presidential election in 1864. And there's a number of people in the North who are ready to give up this war, who are ready to say, this has all been a terrible, terrible mistake. It's been a waste of lives. And this is a war that should not have been fought. Well, the Democratic candidate for president was going to be a former general, someone who had fought for Abraham Lincoln, but he and Lincoln never really got along. But General McClellan, George McClellan was going to be the Democratic candidate for president. And although he has fought in the war and definitely wanted to defeat the South, he thinks it's time to negotiate with the South and settle this. Way too many people have died, and it's really been a failure. So Confederates are really hoping that the election will go the Democrats' way, and the North will be ready to just negotiate, um, allow the Confederacy to go free, and the war can come to an end. But the thing that helps Abraham Lincoln more than anything else prior to Election Day was General Sherman, the subordinate to Ulysses S. Grant, coming from Tennessee, coming through Chattanooga, and eventually capturing Atlanta. That happened just in time for the election, and it really saves Lincoln's election. It seems only a matter of time now that the Union Army is going to win. And in fact, after taking Atlanta, General Sherman was going to cut a path from there to the city of Savannah and then up to Charleston as well. He was no longer chasing after an army. Sherman was just burning everything in sight, burning, any kind of war material. His army would just eat food as they went through and lay waste everything else, taking the war really to the population until they can be screaming for an end to this war. Sherman is not going to be a popular figure in the South. Still a dirty word in Georgia, I'm sure. But Sherman's capturing of Atlanta saves Lincoln's reelection, and then burning through Georgia and into South Carolina helps bring the war closer and closer to an end. The war finally comes to an end after General Lee and Grant were fighting with one another constantly in Virginia. Lee would win some of these battles, but Grant didn't withdraw. He just continued the pursuit, knowing he's eventually going to overwhelm. He has more people. And Grant finally brings Lee to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865. So here, this conflict that lasted almost exactly 4 years results in enormous loss of life. Conservative figures say it's something around 620,000 Americans killed in this conflict. Some stretch that number up even above 700,000. But the United States has still not equaled this number in other wars. If we add World War I and II and Vietnam and Persian Gulf, add up all other American wars together, and they don't equal the loss of lives that take place in this Civil War. It's an enormous conflict. It's hard to do it justice in 50 minutes, but of what great consequence this war is fought. And we'll be talking about some of those huge changes that take place after this turning point in American history. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed and learned something from this. Bye-bye.